Isaiah 7:14. Look, the young woman is with child and about to give birth to a son. Let her name him Emmanuel, God with us. Christians often interpret this passage as referring to Jesus of Nazareth, a boy born of a virgin that carries the divine name and is God in the flesh. To debunk this missionary claim, we must look at the beginning verses of the chapter to see the context of the sign itself, the time limit of the sign, and the purpose of the sign in its fruition. Starting at verse 1 in Isaiah 7, we see that in the reign of King Ahaz, the king of Judah, King Rezin of Aram, and King Pekah, the son of Remaliah of Israel, marched together to attack the kingdom of Judah and the house of David, but were unable to successfully besiege. Moving to verse 3, we see that God instructs Isaiah to go with his son to meet Ahaz and to reassure him that this threat of besieging will not take place. Now, if we continue on to the sign itself, we see that God speaks directly to Ahaz in Isaiah 7, verse 10, saying directly, "Ask for a sign from the eternal your God, anywhere in the depths of Sheol or up in the sky." But Ahaz replied, "I will not ask, I will not test God." God responds to Ahaz by saying, "Listen, house of David, is it not enough for you to weary men and test men, that you will also test your God as well?" Now, before we continue, this verse is often used by Christians to say that God switches the subject of who he's speaking to. Before, initially, the sign was for King Ahaz, and it has now switched to the house of David in its broader context, referring to the Messiah. Debunking this is very simple. Clearly here, Ahaz, being the king of the house of David, is the representational figure for the house of David, as he is the king. And he is the only one who is wearying God and testing God in this passage by refusing to ask for the sign. Nobody else in the house of David, before or after, is testing men and testing God by refusing to ask for the sign. We know that God speaks onto the house of David to show King Ahaz that if he does not comply with God's request, that it will ultimately lead to the complete destruction of the house of David and detrimental consequences. Then God continues, and he says, "Assuredly I will give you a son nonetheless. Look, the young woman is with a child and about to give birth to a son. Let her name him Emmanuel." Now, before we dive in to how the word in this verse, Alma, itself does not mean virgin, but rather young woman, we are going to presuppose, for the sake of the argument, that this woman here is a virgin, just to allow the Christians to have this point. This would still render their argument obsolete for many reasons. If we continue to verse 16, we see it says, "For before the boy knows to reject the bad and choose the good, the ground whose two kings you dread shall be abandoned and laid waste." Now, historically, the two kings that were laid waste here, Rezin of Aram and King Pekah, son of Remaliah, were laid waste 729 BCE, 729 years before Jesus was even born. This becomes very problematic for the Christian claim, because the verse says, "Before the lad knows to reject the bad and choose the good," meaning he's at a young age, and he is not cognitive enough to decide what is good and what is bad, meaning he is already born. The verse does not say, "For before the boy is born." Rather, it says, "For before he is aware enough," meaning he is already at an adolescent age. This would render the timeline for the son way before the time Jesus was even born, debunking the idea that this sign is Jesus contextually. Now that we've established already that the sign itself is directed at King Ahaz, it is for him, for a specific purpose, we must clarify exactly what is the purpose of the sign itself. Well, we know, according to the chapter, that God sends Isaiah to reassure King Ahaz. The name Emmanuel, meaning God with us, being a theophoric name, is not problematic at all. Multiple names in Hebrew have names that sound like they would literally be referring to God, but rather are attributed to God. This is from all the prophets. A good example of this is Jehoshaphat, one of the kings, which means God has judged. Does that mean Jehoshaphat himself is God? Of course not. Rather, the name is attributed to God through the person. Same thing here. However, Emmanuel has a distinct message that God instructed Ahaz to receive, which is plainly that God is with the house of David and the house of Judah, and that they will not fall to the surrounding armies. So by the boy being named Emmanuel, God with us, rather than being a boy man god like Hercules, the child is a reassurance to King Ahaz that his nation and his house itself will remain intact and not befall to the surrounding armies. Now, to put the nail in the coffin, showing how Alma itself does not mean virgin, we turn to Proverbs 30, verses 18 to 21. The verse itself establishes things to King Solomon that are beyond him, that are unimaginable, and that he cannot fathom. How an eagle makes its way over the sky, how a snake makes its way over a rock, how a ship makes its way through the high seas, and how a man has his way with a young woman. Now, each of these things are things that leave no trace. They are concealed. When an eagle flies in the sky, there is no trace remaining. When a snake touches a rock and hovers over a rock, there is no trace. When a ship makes its way through the sea, there is nothing left behind. And when a man has intercourse with a young woman, an Alma, there is no trace remaining. This is very important for the argument, as according to Deuteronomy, a sign for a woman being a virgin is that she leaves a trace of blood. Here we have that when a man sleeps with a woman, there is no trace, showing how this young woman herself is not a virgin, but rather a woman that has slept with a man and has not left a trace. The riddle is then concluded in verse 20. Such is the way of an adulteress. She eats and wipes her mouth and says, I have done no wrong. Concluding the idea that these examples all leave no trace, emphasizing the fact that Alma itself, meaning young woman, is a vague title that, unless prescribed contextually as a virgin or shown through the usage of Betula, is not sound evidence for an immaculate conception. Thank you, and God bless.